Hello, Mandibil here. How are you all doing? I am going to comment on a little video by Stefan Molyneux once again. He's my nemesis. Joking aside, but he's such a turncoat and hypocrite, and it's basically unbelievable what bullshit he's going to get. He seems to be getting away with his audience, and I'm just going to use this as an example of how he seems to be cooking up sort of philosophical or opinions classified as philosophy, maybe supposedly in an attempt to rectify his opinions as sort of universal opinions that are great and whatever. This kind of working with philosophy is so far from the heroic idea of trying to do some thinking for yourself about how you think, how you know, what is ethics and what is morality and so on, right? How do I understand my experience and all that, right? That's sort of the noble attempt by those who are real philosophers, not those who conjure up opinions on the fly to fit into some kind of political or some other agenda, business model, or economic incentives and so on, right? So this is the only conclusion I can draw from what this guy Stefan Molyneux is doing, that he's sort of conjuring up whatever fits into the agenda that he is sort of following at the moment. And it's kind of intriguing. I mean, I had a very sort of, I was a sort of a proponent of doing philosophy, and way back in the day, Stefan Molyneux actually inspired me to do philosophy. But I later come to realize that he's full of it, right? He doesn't know what the hell he's talking about, or maybe he knows as much to make it look like he knows what he's talking about. But when you dig down deeper into what he's saying and what he's writing, and comparing to other times when he said something different or maybe even the opposite, then what argument did he use back then compared to the argument he uses now? And which argument is he going to use in 5 years from now? So this is a sort of an eclatant example of sort of his turncoat maneuvers, in my opinion, right? So this is a video on the 20-year anniversary of the 9/11 incident. And let's just head into it. So let me see if I can start a video. I haven't figured out, I'm using StreamYard because it's sort of free and I don't want to spend too much time. It's simple and easy to use, but I have figured out how to get two shared windows into the stream at once. So I have to sort of have one stream, the video of Stefan Molyneux, and then a podcast he made like 15 years ago, which is relevant in this kind of scenario, right? So, and I'm just going to play that. I'm not going to switch over to a podcast. So let's see how it goes. Let's hope it works out. Okay, here we go.
Where was I then? Don't forget Building 7. Don't start me off annoyed when you can't do anything you want. I'm just telling you, if you are going to, are you almost enlisted? If you're going to drop the, I won't even call conspiracy theories, the alternative theories about 9/11, it's such a waste of time.
Why are you labeling them as alternative theories? Alternative to what? Isn't any theory as valid as any other theory about something, right? You don't say that Newton is an alternative theory to Einstein or vice versa, right? you work progressively to reach a consensus. An alternative, that's already, putting a fork in the road, or cutting up the field to say you're on this side and you're on the other side and so on, right? Why is it an alternative? Alternative to what? Alternative already has an inclination or an inkling towards being a lesser, right? An alternative theory, like alternative media, whatever, right? It can easily become there's the right theory and then there's all the wrong theories, right? Very close, in my opinion, right?
I mean, when I was in history class, I took some summer school courses so I could get out of the hellhole of high school early, and the teacher was a real psycho, and he was really boring, and I was.
So what? An anecdote from your childhood or your youth? What does that have to do with 9/11, right? Or whether or not a theory is alternative or correct or whatever?
16 or 17 years old, and I would occasionally just kind of half doze off because it was early morning classes. And then when I went up to give a presentation once, he screamed at everyone to put their heads down on the desk and pretend to sleep, and then he turned to me and he said, "Doesn't feel so good now, does it? How do you feel when other people do it?" It was real psycho, right? And a really bad hairpiece, I'll tell you that for sure. But he brought in someone to go over the JFK assassination, right? There's a Pruder film, the grassy knoll, the sniper, and he was very keen on this kind of stuff, right? Now, any event that you look at in history, particularly when you have a lot of data, any event that you look at in history is going to have inconsistencies, is going to have.
How do you know that it's data relevant to this whatever event in the past, right? How do you know it's data? And if it's data, how do you know it's data that is it the amount of data that is justification for whatever story you want to tell or you think you are telling about an event, right? An example could be this Floyd. It was George Floyd. He was called the black man who were killed by cops last year. Where you spent, half an hour or maybe an hour and a half or something like that, explaining to people that this was not murder, right? And sort of that's the you are bringing in. You were not there, right? You weren't there. You didn't experience whatever it was. You have a video and you have testimonies and whatever there is of data that. But that could be filtered. How do you know what you're supposed to? Right? If you look at your Wikipedia site page, it looks like you're a fucking semi-Hitler, right? Right. While if you were to write it yourself, it would be different. If one of your acolytes from your cult were writing, they would write you are the greatest thing since sliced bread, right? And so on. So who controls the narrative about what is going on in the world? Well, basically, this is a challenge of what does it mean to know, right? What does it mean to know? And what needs to be in place in order for you to claim that you know? And another thing is that why would you need to claim that you know something if you know it? You can't claim that you know it unless you already know it, right? So you have knowledge if you claim knowledge, right? So you don't need the claim in order to make it knowledge. You don't need to tell anybody else what you know, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to get around on a deserted island, right? Like Tom Hanks. So you already know. So a claim of knowledge, what is that? Isn't that a proposition? You say, I know that's an elephant, right? Okay, but if I know that's an elephant, don't I need to have empirical data that tells me that's an elephant? And if I turn around and look the other way or deprive myself of my senses and so on, can I claim that I know elephant? Well, basically you can't, because you do no longer have the empirical data, the sense data, whatever you want to call it. Okay, so if you bring that into 9/11, what do you really know about 9/11, right? basically you know nothing. There's nothing to know because it's an event in the past, right? So it's just my way of sort of enlightening my listeners on where I stand with regards to claims of insight or knowledge about a past event, right?
Contradictions is going to have problems. It's going to have coincidences. And I watched James Corbett, like 9/11 explained in under 5 minutes or whatever it was. I watched this last night. And yeah, there's a lot of hinky stuff. There's a lot. But here's the thing. I'll tell you why, if you're interested in that kind of stuff. And it is interesting. Don't get me wrong. I mean, it is interesting, and I'm skeptical, and I know that there have been a lot of false flags in the past and so on. But here's the thing. You don't need it. And why you do need it, if you do need it, is an interesting question.
What don't I need? Now, be very careful now, right? I don't need the conspiracies, or don't I need the official story, or don't I need any of it, right? Because if you're going to tell me that, no, you don't need all these conspiracies, you only need to listen to the official story, then you're full of shit, right? Because the official story is just what you're being told is going on, right? There you are putting the authority on somebody from the mainstream media and the state and whoever, right? Telling you what is going on, rather than you using whatever small piece of evidence you have leading to any particular conclusion, right? If that's what you're going with, you're full of it, right? You're full of shit, right?
You don't need it. The state.
But why you're telling me what I need? Yeah, then you would say, well, I'm not talking to you particularly. No, but I'm listening, right? I don't need it? What do you mean, right? I understand that there might be someone who sense that whatever culture and family and state and all sorts of shit they have been groomed with during their youth and childhood, that they seem to channel that out through UFOs and Area 51 and JFK conspiracies, 9/11, so on, right? And that's sort of a get out of jail card where you can sort of conjure up whatever conclusions you want and then get sort of a relief from culture, which is basically a conspiracy against children, right? Culture is a conspiracy against children, grown-ups conspiring to create new grown-ups out of children who have a open and but sensitive mind that can either end up thinking for itself or thinking for the group, right? And the conspiracy of culture is you have to conform these children into, manipulate these children into conforming to the group that the grown-ups, the parents, are already a part of, right? That's a conspiracy. It's a conspiracy no matter how you turn it around, right? But it's hard to adjust to the notion that your parents were out to manipulate you, and religion and state and all that was only there to manipulate you, to control you, right? So it's a sort of a relief to go into conspiracy theories and finding all sorts of other people that you can vent your sort of passive aggressive anger against, so you don't have to confront the real problem, which is your parents and your state and so on, right? So I would say that's a problem, and if that's what you're mentioning, fine, I'll go with that, but that's not what I'm interested in here, because this is a philosophy show, right? Or supposedly. So we're dealing with basically what does it mean to know something, right? So if you're going to say you don't need it, no, that might be the case, as I argued just now, right? It's a sort of a psychological trick you use on yourself to avoid confronting those people who are actually responsible for creating or manipulating you, right? But if that's it, okay, then why is it 1.5 hour long, this show, right? Are you not going to talk about the official story then, or what?
It's a violation of the non-aggression principle. What it does with that violation of the non-aggression principle is like asking what happens to your money after it gets stolen. It doesn't matter what happens to your money after you get.
But aren't you saying now indirectly that the state is involved in the incident, whether or not the state is involved or some third party nobody knows about or whatever is involved in 9/11 in the specific events, or they just took advantage of a crisis and created all sorts of the Patriot Act and all that shit, right? And started wars in the Middle East yet again. Used that as a sort of excuse, right? It just seems to. What are you saying, right? I mean, you're saying a state is involved somehow, but it's not. The problem is not the symptoms. You're saying that 9/11 is sort of a symptom of the violation of the non-aggression principle, which is people from the state stealing your money, right? And doing whatever they want, basically, with it, right? Creating new money, using it as collateral for this, that, or the other. So 9/11 is a spin-off or a result of this violation, right? Okay, but then you're saying the state is involved, aren't you? I mean, what are you really saying?
After it's stolen from you. What matters is that it's stolen from you. So the government, as a violation of the non-aggression principle, because it initiates the use of force against its citizens, but let's say that all of the...
They initiate the threat of force. They rarely have to use initiation of force, right? They are threatening with force by using what they call laws, which is an implicit rule that you have to follow. And if you don't follow, you are the one initiating whatever failure to follow those orders that you are given. And you are then the problem, and they're just defending the law. That's the argument they use, right? And that's one of the problems with using NAP, or the non-aggression principle, as an argument for morality, because people can't understand what it is meant by this, right? And I know there's a lot of political ridicule of people from the hard right, or whatever you want to call it, anarchists and libertarians and so on, who basically want to. I mean, it's not a bad idea. It's not useless, the non-aggression principle, but it doesn't work, right? It doesn't work because right-leaning people are very into laws, right? They love laws because just like the left want to, the right want to control everybody into their kind of order, right? So they want to make laws that control people in the fashion they think people should be controlled, right? So it's not like anarchists are against laws, and if you go to the furthest right, you could even say that anarchist is not even in the political spectrum. And that would be a fair argument, I think. But that anarchists say that anarchism is not no rulers. No, it's not no rules, it's no rulers, right? There's no dictation about what the rules are, right? But anarchism doesn't mean that there are no rules. So even anarchists will say that there are rules. Okay, and this kind of sort of word trick, saying no rules instead of no rulers, sounds easy, but what does it really entail, these rules? How does these rules come about? Who are dictating those rules? Can I make rules? Right? Can I make rules even if there's a state making rules enforced by threat of violence? Right? So how does that work? I have never had any anarchist explaining this in a sufficient manner other than it'll just happen. Okay, fine. it'll just happen, but give me an example of how you think it would happen, right? How would that sort of come about? And if people have to follow these rules, or some people have to follow those rules, you're not making rules for yourself. I don't know, I mean, so these rules are in place. And even anarchists, in my opinion, would say that, okay, if you don't follow the rules, there will be consequences. But if the consequence is some kind of violence, then are you not, as an anarchist, initiating violence? Then the anarchist would say, no, because there are rules. But isn't that what the state is saying? I mean, so it all kinds of fades into nothing, in my opinion, right? It's a sleeping bag. What's it called? It's a pillow that the anarchists sleep on, that they sort of stay within, even if they're anarchists, just like atheists, they stay within a paradigm of thinking that is based on what they don't like, right? So they can't get out of that and think anew and clean slate and philosophy and all that. And that goes for Stefan Molyneux also, it seems, right? He can't get out of this political thinking. He simply can't. And recently he stated that what UPB, or universally preferred behavior, which is his ethics about, or his ethics basically, or his so-called ethical framework for judging moral statements, which I have deconstructed in a very long 12-part series on my YouTube site, and it would also be at least some of it available on Odysee. He stated that, well, UPB would get rid of communism. So the politics are not mentioned in UPB, the book, at least not in a fashion that goes as far as saying that UPB would get rid of some political system, right? So now all of a sudden he brings it, okay, this within this situation I'm speaking now, it makes sense for me to say that UPB would get rid. It wouldn't help you, actually, he said, it wouldn't help you if you are getting mocked by someone with a gun trying to steal your wallet, but it will help you against communism. I was like, what? Then I really don't need UPB, because I want to make sure that I'm not stolen from, right? Because what you're calling the government and that initiation force, that would be somebody coming to mock me in some way or another, or initiating violence, or whatever you want to call it. They might call themselves the state or the police, or whatever, but it's still a person, it's still an individual or a couple of individuals trying to do something with me, right? And that's the situation I'm going to deal with, right? This the idea of government is not attacking me, it's individuals attacking me, and that's what I need to understand how to handle in a moral system, right?
Alternate theories regarding 9/11 are true. I don't believe that they are, but let's say that they are. Okay. So governments did terrible things with the money and power that they took from people by force. You understand that the reason you would focus on a particular thing like 9/11 or the JFK assassination or Tuskegee experiments or whatever it is it's a way of drawing people's attention away from the essential moral issues regarding the state. You're actually working for the state. You're making things worse. I'm sorry, you really are. You really are. Because you're saying this, what the government did, is really terrible. By definition, that means that the essence of government is not terrible.
No, because what you are saying here is that people have the same incentive that you have, that people want to sit in their living room and telling the rest of the world to focus on whether or not this building is falling at a speed that couldn't be done by an airplane or whatever, right? That is the incentive of people. But you're like the thief who thinks that everybody steals, right? Everybody else has the same incentive that I have, sitting in my living room telling people about what happens out in the world, right? And you're afraid that if people are focused whether or not this building falling and this and that speed, is that taking focus away from the real problem, which is stealing people's money over here, right? And to some extent, I agree with that. But that is not the incentive of people who really want to understand what is going on, right? If you can get under the skin of people by making it kind of plausible that the official story wasn't necessarily quite that good, then you can create as much skepticism in people so that they will eventually end up actually rejecting the state and thereby accepting that stealing people's money is wrong. Because the only way that the state can keep doing this is if they got the balls on people, either by giving them a very good incentive to let the state keep going, like, single mothers who want all that money from the state in one way or the other, or people are just sensitive to the moral arguments, like what about the sick and the old and the children and whatever, right? Are they just going to die in the streets or what? But first of all, in my opinion, trying to understand, if you go with a sort of investigation by your own into what really happened, well, what would you do if you were going to attempt to do that? Well, you're not going to listen to Dick Cheney, right? You're not going to listen to George Bush, right? You're going to find some video or some voice recording or some description or some scientist describing how things fall and so on, in order to figure out whether, because it's an important story. It has been haunting us for 20 years, right? And the important part is not what are you going to focus on, and your little mind. You're sort of belittling people, like lecturing on them what they should focus on, right? That it's an intervention into your propaganda. It's an intervention into your habitual thinking that what you are told in the media and by your politicians is truth, is knowledge, right? It isn't. And if the philosophical stance that it would end up with would be that you don't know anything about what happened somewhere else 20 years ago. It's absolutely impossible to know, right? None of the stories are valid, right? None of them. In fact, if you're going for knowledge, if you're going with evidence and see where does the evidence, not the official stories, not what the mainstream media told you or George Bush told you, Dick Cheney told you, or whatever, who it was who told you something about this is what was happening on 9/11, right? Then the official story doesn't look that good, right? But the core is figuring out what does it mean to know something. That is what you should deal with as a philosopher. What does it mean to know something, right? So it also has relevance to the rest of what you're saying on your channel.
Say, oh well, the government did really, really bad. If the theory, they shot JFK, whatever, it was an inside job and so on, right? Even if you're 100% correct, I don't think you are, but even if you're 100% correct, all you're doing is whitewashing everything else. You're saying, okay, if you focus on some guy, let's say
I don't buy that. Just because you are looking at the evidence, if that's what you attempt about an event that went on 20 years ago, doesn't mean that you are whitewashing everything else, right? I understand where you're trying to go with that. Don't spend all your day getting hung up on little details here and there, so you overlook the bigger picture of what is really going on. And I understand that the military-industrial complex, taxation and money printing and all that shit. I understand that. But the underlying thing is still, as I say, it's about what does it mean to know something, right? And if you were that kind of skeptic, you would have to have that angle when you are heading further into this video about 9/11, and let's see how it goes.
The serial killer, right? And then you say, well, this murder he did was really terrible. This murder he did was really terrible. You understand? You're kind of whitewashing all the other murders. You're focusing on one particular thing. Now, I know people have the theory, well, if this is believed and if it's accepted, if it becomes widespread, people will wake up and blah, no. It's the moral. All you need is the moral argument.
Oh, the moral argument. Let's have it. Okay, let's fucking have that moral argument. And please tell me on what page of UPB I can get it, right? Don't tell me I have to read 130 pages of UPB to figure out where that moral argument is. Give me the fucking moral argument in a way that I can put on the wall, right? Let me so I can print it out on a poster and put it on the wall and say, this is the moral argument, Stefan Molyneux, right? M.A. My ass. So what is the moral argument?
All you need is the moral argument. The non-aggression principle.
The non-aggression principle. Okay. So the non-aggression is the moral argument. As I has pointed out before and in many other videos, it doesn't hang together. The moral. I'm not saying it's a bad principle to follow, but it doesn't hang together, right? You can't agree upon what initiation of forces. That's exactly what the state is trying all the time to violate, right? They are saying we have to make laws. People want the state to make laws. And if you don't follow those laws, you are initiating some kind of whatever violence, or at least you're initiating something that validates that they are reacting on you and saying, we are not the ones breaking the law. You're the one breaking the law. So we have to initiate violence on you, right? No, it's just too loose. And another thing is that I pointed out in my deconstruction of UPB, you can find it on my YouTube channel by the same name, Mandibil, that I can't find a philosophical, rigid proof, quote, proof of NAP, right? Or an argument. How is it philosophically argued, right? It just like, all I have heard is, well, it feels right. It sounds right. Don't initiate force, and only if you are attacked, then you can, defend yourself using force. It sounds like, yeah, it's the only argument I've heard is something like that. Now, I may be oblivious to some kind of, Murray Rothbard or Hans Hermann Hoppe or whoever has delved into these areas, have somewhere a proof, and I would like to see it, right? And the other point I want to make is that Stefan Molyneux already has it in the non-aggression principle. It goes back decades, right? Maybe centuries. And he knew of that already before he wrote his book on ethics. So if that's his moral principle, he will inevitably making sure that his morality or his ethical arguments fits the NAP. He's going to make sure that it does connect in a way that doesn't invalidate NAP, right? It's inevitable. It can't. You can't start with a principle and then sort of, well, at least not in the way he argues, I would say it, right? He doesn't deal with meta-ethics. He doesn't deal with knowledge. He doesn't deal with defining things. Or he just jumps into the river and starts arguing left and right, and then condenses it into what he called UPB, and then he say NAP checks out through this, right? So if he was starting with metaphysics and then going to epistemology and then to objectivity and then to ethics and then a moral principle, I assure you that moral principle wouldn't look quite like NAP, right? So maybe that's why he's starting just trying to make a system of morality or system of ethics or meta-ethics that can check out a moral statement rather than creating a system that creates a moral principle, and even a perfect moral principle, which is the principle to rule all other principles, right? which I would say is a moral principle. There's no higher principle than a moral principle. And there has to be only one. And it has to be usable by everybody, right? So I don't have too much. First of all, I don't have too much too good an eye for UPB, because it seems that it's wrapped around the NAP. And the NAP, I haven't been able to find any proof of NAP that is sufficiently rigid, in my opinion. So it's like, well, what are we talking about, right? You're just pulling this NAP out of your ass without doing the philosophical, rigid argumentation that must lead to this is the perfect moral principle, right?
Property rights, self-ownership, free will. The gun in the room, as I sort of pointed out. All you need is the moral argument. And everything you do that distracts from the moral argument is a justification for immorality.
That's a bit of a mouthful, I would say, right? So unless you are constantly, every day, 24 hours, or all your waking hours are focusing on the moral argument, you are whitewashing the state, right? So if I'm going to take a dump and read a newspaper, and I'm not thinking about a moral argument, I'm being immoral, right? Come on, man, right? This is hyperbole, right? Why are you arguing like this? Right? Why are you arguing like this? What are you trying to do? Right? Are you trying to look like you are very, you can see the bigger picture of the world? And that, I would agree, you can do that to some extent, right? But it always ends up being this very clearly cut black and white situation. If you don't do this, you're immoral, and you could be shot, and you should be shot, and sort of there's no flexibility in your philosophy, right? There's no flexibility at all. It's either, if you're not thinking about the moral argument, you're being a fucking immoral. So I'm going to take a dump and reading the newspaper. Meanwhile, I'm being immoral. I mean, come on, man, right? It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous argument, and I would say that you trying to always focus on this state thing, you are actually taking the focus away from good philosophy, right? You're taking the focus away from good ethics, good metaphysics, good epistemology, good objectivity, and good ethics, right? Just by saying, if you don't do this, you're bad, right? It's very big for you in the recent years, sort of labeling certain groups of people as bad people, right? And in my opinion, this is a result of your book about ethics, UPB, being a pile of shit, right? You understand that it doesn't work. Nobody takes it seriously. Even if it did work, nobody is using it. Nobody outside your sphere of free domain is reading the book. And those few who have done it are, face palming into what the hell is he writing, right? You're wasting everybody's time, right? By dragging them around, and you change turncoding into now you're pro-state, and now you're against state, now you're pro-religion, now you're against religion, now you're pro-morality this way and against morality that way, and it's all sort of, what the hell are you doing? I mean, aren't there any critical people in your sphere on free domain? Are they every one of them licking your ass and saying you're great? And another way to approach it is to say, every critical or skeptical person or thinker who might venture into your inner circle thrown out to the street if they don't comply with your thinking, right? You don't get any response. You're sitting like the big spider in the middle of the web. If anybody comes in who doesn't follow your orders, they're sort of, kicked off and told that they are sort of out to get me, and they are nihilists, and they're communists, and they are edgelords, and they're right. For a philosopher, you are not really that much interested in debating, which you have argued for many times, like, you know, the Socratic dialogues and all that, right? But all I hear is somebody sitting in his room talking to himself about things that are not really philosophy.
To take another analogy, if there was a serial killer around who tortured and slaughtered his victims in gruesome ways, and you said, I have absolute proof that he double parked during rush hour. He double parked during rush hour. You understand that by focusing on him double parking during rush hour, or getting a speeding ticket, or kicking a dog, that you're saying that by focusing on...
No, but they got rid of Al Capone for tax evasion, didn't they? Not because he was bootlegging spirits and whatever he did, right? They got him for tax evasion. Well, the state got him because state made the law that made him... I know that's not exactly moral, but at least he did. If you can get a murder by get him into jail for double parking, well, what does it matter? You get rid of him, right? Or her. I know what you're trying to argue, but be careful that you're not taking focus away from people's ability to think for themselves and follow the evidence, right? That's very important. What you're trying to go at, it seems to me, it is obey your masters, right? Obey those who says, this is knowledge. This is how you should think. This is what happened on 9/11. You should believe this, or otherwise you're a tinfoil idiot, right? That's where I see this going.
That you are overleaping everything else that the serial killer has done. By getting people to focus on that, you are avoiding the fundamental moral argument that he's a serial killer, right? I mean, so just don't. You can if you want. A guy can commit 100 murders, but if you only have evidence of one, that's the only thing that truly matters. You see, but you're...
Yeah, good point. You don't know that a person is a serial killer. You only know it, quote, when you're told that the guy or girl is a serial killer, right? How, if you're walking down the street, how would you identify a serial killer, right? How would you? What's the evidence of a serial killer? Does he have to commit a murder on the street more than one time? Once? At least twice for you to say, aha, that's a serial killer. But then it's not the person you are referring to, then it's the actions. So it's sort of an artifact of Christian thinking that there's good people and bad people, right? Good people are always good, bad people are always bad, right? They are the devil's spawn, they are whatever, they are evil people, right? That's not how the reality works. There's nothing that is inherent evil in anybody, right? It's only when the action leads to something that is immoral that you can claim any sort of evilness, right? But that is only an incident. That's not staying. If you did something, if you double parked a car sometime 30 years ago, you are not a double parking guy, are you? Right? So you are forever a double parking guy. Or if you stole a candy bar 40 years ago, you are a candy bar stealer, or what? Is that the thinking? Because that's stupid, right? You have to look at what is going on. You can't label people as this or that because you do not have that insight, right?
You're making the case that you need... You're making the case that you need proof of murder when you already have a confession. I mean, Barack Obama said the state is an agency of force. It's political science 101. The state is the...
Yes, and everybody knows that, or most people know that, right? and if they know it deep down in the, in the oldest part of your brain, which is actually the closest thing to reality or the correct understanding of the world, you could say, right? But people accept it, right? Everybody in your surroundings understand that the state is a threat of violence. Everybody understands that. But if the majority of people in the world accept it, then nothing is going to happen about you telling other people, even if they realize it and say, well, yeah, I guess it's violence, but it's justified violence, right? And that's also the most arguments I've seen against the NAP. People come up and find some kind of sort of edgelord situation or a trolley problem situation where in this situation, it's okay to use violence because you're saving 100 people by, taking all the organs from one person and giving to everybody else, and then you're saving 100 people by sacrificing one people, and you are initiating violence to save the world, and all that, right? You can't have a revolution without breaking some eggs and all that, right? So where's the argument, right? Instead of just referring to the NAP, give us the freaking philosophically rigid argument for why NAP is valid and how I go about applying it in my everyday. Because all I hear is, don't initiate violence, right? But I never initiate violence. Very, very, very rarely, right? I can only think of where I thought I was in a situation where I should defend myself using a kind of violence, right? Or at least something along those lines. And you could discuss, was I defending or was I initiating? And that's also one of the problems with NAP, because there's no definition of what violence is or what initiation is. Why don't you spend some time explaining the NAP from A to Z and how you apply it in your everyday, right? And also you could say, how do I handle people who does not follow the NAP? What do I do, right? Do I initiate something, or do I defend myself against them initiating something by not following the NAP, or what do I do, right? The NAP does not work. Come on, man, right? That's why UPB sucks, because all it was a justification for something that has already been argued for, or at least was still in use or already in use, right? And maybe, just maybe, this lack of a perfect moral principle is exactly why people are spending time trying to figure out whether or not the 9/11 was an inside job or not, right? They feel they have to get down to facts. They have to get down to evidence, because more philosophers, they suck like a vacuum, right?
Legal entity with the monopoly on the initiation of the use of force in a geographical area. You already have a confession. So when you have a confession, why are you fussing about with esoteric details of one particular crime when you have a confession? I don't know why you would do that, other than you don't want to deal with the moral issues. You want to skirt around the asbestos and the squibs and the free fall and building 7 and where did the plane go and could the wingspan fit into the Pentagon, and they were looking for $2 trillion that was missing and the paperwork is all gone. And
okay, so you're saying you are not focusing on the morality if you're spending time on these details, right? Now, as far as I understand of what you have said, the book Universally Perfect Behavior, UPB, let's call it UPB, that you wrote around 2006, in late 2006, maybe early 2007, I'm not quite sure. You clearly state that you have spent a lot of time, a lot of years, and so on, thinking about this moral question. But at the same time, I found this podcast, which is from 12th of January 2006, which deals with 9/11. So January 2006, that would be just about the time, possibly, when you started writing your book on ethics. It might even be during or slightly after. I don't know. So if you were spending time on 9/11 on the complete opposite side of this line you just drawn, right? You kind of been spending time on reality that you claim you have spent time on for 20 years before you wrote the book, right? Following the argument you just made in this video.
Terrorism, and one of my email contributors has, and now twice, and I apologize for not doing this before, but has twice pointed out that I keep talking about 9/11 as if it were a fait accompli, that the terrorists simply did what everybody said they did, even though there's a good deal of evidence against this possibility. That there's simply no way that a steel structure could collapse based on a fire, right? I think steel melts at 1600 degrees. The fire never got that warm. There were buildings that were never even hit by the planes that collapsed as well. There's just that they have the buildings were able to withstand. I mean, if you saw when the planes hit the twin towers, they barely shook, right? I mean, that the buildings could absolutely withstand all of this, and that the demolition was far too vertical for it to be a sort of melting sag of the central steel skeleton. The buildings kind of went down, and also that there's suspicious plumes of smoke that rise up from the base of the buildings right before they come down, and so on. And there's a Hunt the Boeing site where they talk about how it's just impossible for the damage to the Pentagon to be created by the airliner, and there are no, the photos were taken, the photos that were released were inconclusive, and hinted at other things, like the white smoke that came out of the back was more indicative of a missile, and also that all of the security camera videos from shops across the way were sort of removed by the FBI, that everybody went along the ground picking up debris, and so I absolutely fully accept that. It seems very strong probability, if not a close to certainty, that what happened on 9/11 is not the official events. And of course, that would be completely consistent with war in the past, right? I mean, in the Spanish-American Civil War, the Chesapeake was supposed to have been blown up by Spaniards when it wasn't the case. It just had a boiler explosion and nobody could figure out where it came from. With World War II, the surprise attack by the Japanese was not exactly a surprise. With Germany, its invasion of Poland, they actually, I think there was a radio station along the border that the Gestapo came in and shot it up, and then left, Czech weaponry there. So Polish weaponry. So they pretended that Poland had attacked Germany, and that it was a response. In the Korean War, in the Gulf of Tonkin, when the American ships were supposed to be struck. Of course, nobody says what the hell were our ships doing in the Gulf of Tonkin to begin with, but even that is the case. It turned out to be not at all the case, that it came from the Koreans, but it was internal to the U.S. As I mentioned in a podcast before, and mistakenly mentioned American submarines rather than German submarines, but I'm sure you got the point, that FDR was constantly trying to put American shipping in the danger zone of German submarines, and hoping for an incident that would provoke a war. So it would certainly be completely consistent with the history of warfare that either the sort of quote terrorists were funded by, or the U.S. had knowledge of, or strong indications of, and the fact that the planes were I think only 25% full when they're normally 75% full that particular morning, and there were a number of people told not to fly. I think Salman Rushdie was one of them. And so, the fact is that there are strong indications that, the official story is not the case. And I mean, that would not shock me at all, that the official story was not the case. There's also some indications that the bombing of the World Trade Centers in 1992, I think it was, or 93, that was funded by and with the full knowledge of the FBI. So it would not be at all surprising to me to find out that what really happened had no relation to the official story. I'm sure it has no relation to the official story, but the degree to which it has no relation to me remains unknown. The thing that I just conceptually have trouble getting around in my head is what happened to the bodies of the planes that were downed. If it was remote control planes that flew into the Trade Center, as you could sort of see from this sort of bulge underneath the lid, and if there was a flash that occurred before, the planes went into the Trade Center buildings, which you can also see, that would be an igniting flash and so on. And if it all was a complete setup, then the U.S. government would have sort of authorized, or the incineration of all of the people on those planes. And I would not find that at all surprising in a sheer dictatorship, but I would think that would be a risk that would be too high for the U.S. government with the current level of freedom, which is not inconsequential still. And the fact is that there is an internet and there is an alternate media and so on. So I do find that to be perfectly consistent with governments, right? That they're more than willing to kill their own citizens, as we could see with Pearl Harbor, in order to achieve a war. But I think that if they actually did incinerate hundreds of their own citizens in order to produce these sort of charred bodies, lock them in a room and set off a bomb or whatever, I think that that's simply too risky and not particularly necessary. There's lots of people who will do the dirty work of the state that you can pay in sort of unverifiable transfer situations. And so I can do another podcast on this, which gives a bit more detail, but I do find that it is a stretch for me to figure out exactly how that is a good idea. And you know what? Actually, let's dump the war thing, because I spent like 20 minutes on non-war stuff. So I'll do war.
Okay. So what we have here, it's clearly someone who has studied a lot of details about 9/11, among other sort of traditionally thought of as false flags going back to the Spanish-American War and whatever, right? The Vietnam War, the Second World War, the First World War, and Lusitania, and all that shit, right? JFK, 9/11, and now COVID also, right? But he wants to sort of apparently backpedal. I know that he sort of balanced his sort of, in that old podcast from 2006, balanced his that it's not all likely that it's the state. But who says it's the state? Well, you don't have to have a clear-cut explanation of who in order to look at the evidence. In fact, what you shouldn't do exactly is not finding out this must be how it happened. What you should do is, if there's an official story, say, this evidence doesn't fit with the official story, this evidence doesn't fit with the official story, and this evidence doesn't fit, and this evidence is missing, and so on and so on and so on. Don't conjure up an explanation of what happened, because that is as stupid as making an official story, right? And that is exactly what debunkers are going to attack. Is saying, but you can't know that, right? How do you know it's whatever, Dick Cheney, whatever, right? Well, you don't, because you can't. You can't know it, right? It can only be sort of speculation, right? So my point is really, why are you backpedaling so much on this conspiracy shit, which you apparently was so engaged with 15 years ago, right? So what you're saying now is that you were wasting your time looking at conspiracy shit instead of working on the moral principle, right? Otherwise, your argument doesn't hold now, right? You're saying people shouldn't focus on these details. They should rather focus on the moral principle. So back then, you were spending a lot of time up until at least early 2006 about these kind of conspiracies and details and evidence, right? You can just on the top of your head, you can list them up, right? So they must be present in your mind, right? So you have been spending time on this shit until you write this book, UPB. So you are sort of saying that you weren't focused on the right things, right? And another thing might be that you're sort of fitting UPB around these this mentality may be, right? If this mentality is a large part of your mind, it's inevitable that it will, bleed off into your UPB thinking, right? So it's just sort of hypocritical, or what is that? It's a sort of turncoat mentality, right? What was going on back then, 2006, right? So we can't trust whatever you were thinking back then, or what? So when you're saying, I've been a philosopher for 40 years, that's bullshit, because what you did 15 years ago sucks, according to yourself. So what are you doing, right? What the hell are you doing?
You found a passport here and this impossible aerial maneuver and so on. It's like, but you have a confession. The state openly says it's an agency of coercion. It seems odd to me. It seems odd to me. It's like you don't want to just make the moral case. The moral case you don't need evidence for. It's...
No, you need philosophy. And your UPB sucks like it's a definition of sucking, right? Or sucking philosophy. It doesn't work. I have deconstructed it to the proof, so-called proof, to the smallest detail, every single sentence from page 1 to page 40 or whatever it is, right? And it sucks, right? It doesn't hold together. And you're just pulling NAP out of your ass as if everybody knows it has been sort of argued for. I haven't seen that argument. Even I've tried to find some argument. I can't find anything, right? It may be somewhere, but it might be a good idea to give your listeners that proof of NAP that you constantly refer to. I'm not saying that it's necessarily invalid, but at least instead of saying this is the moral principle you should go out and handle the state with, right? What the hell am I going to do if what can I do with that principle, right? I can't do anything. I just shouldn't start fighting with anybody. Okay, is that going to bring the state down? No, it isn't. But if I can successfully point out that 9/11 was an inside job, that might actually waking up some people saying that is fucking crazy, man, right? And then keep going with JFK and whatever you want, right? Lusitania, whatever. You might actually wake people up. But what do I do with NAP? Yes, I know, I understand it's very likely that the state is immoral. But what the fuck do I do, right? You're not telling anybody. You're not saying anything.
It's like if somebody comes along and says slavery is immoral because it's the initiation of the use of force and it denies self-ownership. You can't both have property and be property, right? And so, and you say, well, but we're going to need to go around and interview a whole bunch of slaves and find out if all of them are miserable. And it's like, what empirical evidence do you need when you have a clear violation of the non-aggression principle called slavery? Rape is immoral. There is a minority of women who experience orgasm during rape. That doesn't mean that rape is any less immoral. Morality specifically denies empiricism. Morality is the first principles. Under science, you need empiricism. I get all of that. Certain epistemological conclusions, you will need empiricism. Morality, this is whole.
Certain epistemological conclusion. But are you drawing conclusion from epistemology? Epistemology is an understanding of what it means to know something. So are you drawing knowledge out of epistemology? Are you drawing knowledge out of approach to knowledge? Or what are you saying? Right? This is serious. This is now you're dealing with specific reference to philosophy, right? Some need, so not all knowledge needs empiricism. But I thought you were an empiricist, right? Weren't you an empiricist? Which means that knowledge can only be gained through empirical data, which is sense data in the now, right? So you're sort of halfway saying that you can have some sort of a priori knowledge, or what?
Whole point of universally preferable behavior. Morality does not require, and in fact is undermined by a demand for empirical evidence.
But isn't your
What is the empirical evidence that rape is
isn't your freaking book about UPB ethics? Isn't it science is everything and it will prove my moral theory, right? And isn't science based on empiricism, as you just say? And now you're saying morality has nothing to do with empiricism. Are you fucking crazy? What's the matter with you? What are you doing? I mean, even if I try to make some sense of the shit you're saying, it's so contradictory that there's no possible way that anybody can make any sense of what you call ethics or what you call your ethics, UPB. So how can I trust NAP if I can't trust UPB, right? Would you mind spend an hour or so or whatever it takes to thoroughly go through your metaphysics, your epistemology, and what it means to be objective, and how you go about proving NAP, right? Please, because it can't be trusted, this bullshit you're pulling, right?
universally immoral? Well, people don't like it, or women resist it, or men resist it. It's like, okay, well, men and women resist a lot of things. They resist taxation. They resist they resist censorship, man. And certainly not everybody finds it universally wrong, because some people are rapists. Damn them, their hides. So if you start looking for empirical evidence when you already have a clear moral argument, it's because you want to avoid the clear moral argument. That's all.
Let us have that clear moral argument, please. Would you mind? Give us the fucking argument. Just saying NAP is not an argument, right? You're famous for saying not an argument. Well, I'm calling not an argument on that one. Just saying NAP is not an argument. Right? It can't both be an argument and a principle at the same time, right? Come on, man.
If you are looking for complicated and convoluted empirical evidence for wrongdoing when you already have a clear moral argument and a confession in its essence, if you already have...
I don't have that clear moral argument. I don't freaking have a clear moral argument. Okay, you can say that if the NAP is valid, and you say, when I apply it to what the state does, or those who represent the state, they are violating the principle. Okay, if that's your argument, well, okay, fine. But that entails that NAP is valid, right? And you haven't argued for NAP and why it's valid. Because you haven't stated your metaphysics, you haven't stated your epistemology in a clear fashion, or truth, or knowledge and objectivity, and what does mean in a simple fashion that normal people can understand. And why from that it follows the ethics that must lead to the moral principle called NAP, right? Instead of spending your time talking about all sorts of ridiculous stuff, why don't you spend some time doing philosophy instead, right? You're supposed to be a philosopher.
Have someone who's a serial killer who says, I kill for fun, I enjoy it, whatever, right? And then you say, well, but that one murder is really complicated and we got to get more evidence. Like, it's no. No, it's a huge, and you know, the CIA, I mean, who came up with the conspiracy theory term, the CIA regularly would release, like if the JFK stuff began to die down, then the CIA or the government would sometimes release more information just to fuel it back up again and have people distracted by the pursuit of this complicated. I mean, and you're not a judge. You're not a prosecutor. You can't subpoena. You can't demand evidence. You can't cross-examine witnesses under oath. I mean, you don't have these powers.
Exactly.
So the idea that amateur sleuths I don't know. It's just
Exactly.
there's a huge amount of time and energy that is consumed, and I would argue wasted. Because here's the thing now. So the JFK thing, was it 64, 63, 63 or something like that, right? So come on, it's 60 years almost, right? It's 60 years.
Mhm.
And what has come of it?
It has been,
What has come of?
It's been 2,400 years since Socrates died. Right? How do we trust what Plato says about him? Huh? Why do we trust that? Do you trust that? The second-hand literary description of Socrates and arguments for this and that and the other? Why do we trust that? Shouldn't we just put that to rest?
Hundreds of thousands of people pouring millions and millions of hours into the JFK thing. Could Lee Harvey Oswald have reloaded twice? And was there another shooter? And let's look at the Super Pruder film, frame by frame.
Yeah, but people think that by handing over evidence, they can convince people about the immorality of the state. And I agree that is not going to work. What you can do is make them as skeptical as you possibly can about official stories about everything, right? Their understanding of what it means to know something. That's what you can do with it, right? And why it's a good idea, in my opinion, at least sometimes, using these specific scenarios, because everybody has a official story narrative that they follow, that they just swallowed like it was, a lovely pizza, right? They just swallowed whatever they were told, right? And if you are able to challenge how they think they know something, then you could be a sort of a Socratic philosopher that sort of undermines people's stoic belief that what they have been told must be right just because they were told that, right? So this is how I approach it. I mean, I have a personal idea of I want to spend time on these things because it gives me a challenge or a reason for thinking about what it means to know something. I was actually, my understanding of epistemology, or my conclusions, or my settlement about epistemology was very much influenced by hearing arguments pro and con, like round Earth or moon landings or 9/11 and so on, right? Because they are basically challenges on what it means to know something, right? When you claim that you know something because you were told so, it's not knowledge. It can never be, right? Because then you would know about Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy and all that, right? It's not knowledge because you're told something. It can never be. Most notably, as you might point out yourself, there is no empirical data for you to claim that you have that knowledge. And if you say it's a theory or it's an evidential conclusion, fine. But people treat it as if it is knowledge. Otherwise, the whole idea of knowledge loses its validity, because if you can just have, I'm sufficiently satisfied with the evidence and I'm going to believe that I know this. Well, what do we need knowledge for? Because knowledge means to be either true or false, right? It's not a matter of degree. It can't be, I have sufficient amount of evidence that leads me to finally draw the conclusion that now I know this, right? That can't be knowledge, right? What is that drop that finally reaches you, that make you reach that pinnacle that says now it's knowledge? But you can't. You can pile evidence as much as you want. If you do not have empirical data, you do not have knowledge. Done.
Frame and blah. What has come of all of that? And now, 20 years after 9/11, all of the amount of time and energy that's been poured into analyzing frame by frame, and could it have fallen faster than free fall, and who said pull the buildings, and who profited from the airline stock being shorted the day before, and okay, what has come of it? What has come of it? What have you done?
Yeah, what has come of your moral principle, right? What has come of it? Or your moral principle. In fact, it's not your moral principle. It's something that was figured out by people before you, 50, 100 years ago, the NAP, and you made a system that checks out you NAP. What has happened since people invested time and thinking into NAP? It has only got worse, right? There's only become more state. There's only arrived more state and higher taxes. And, if the NAP was developed in the late 1800s, where in the Belle Park, and there were 0 or 2% taxes or whatever, it has only got worse, right? How is your NAP doing, right? Maybe exactly because your NAP sucks like a vacuum. People are spending time on the 9/11 instead, because they have no moral argument. They have no moral principle that works, right? Maybe you should give that a thought.
Now, for me, I have convinced hundreds of thousands of people to stop hitting their children. At least. Could be in the millions. 800 million views and downloads. Could be in the millions.
Or it could be, but you don't know that. Now you're just fabulating about how good you are.
Let's just say, let's be conservative. A couple of 100,000 people. I have.
But are you just pulling those numbers out of your ass? You're trusting when people call you and say, "Yeah, we stopped beating our children," and then 3 weeks later they start beating them, and they are not calling in to tell you, "Well, by the way, we started beating our children again," right? So now you want to sell your product and say you're so divine, and yeah, great that if you can, a childless that is being beaten is just absolutely great. No doubt about that. I'm all for it. I'm all for it. Believe me, I'm all for that. But it's not an argument for your moral principle, right? If you say to people, "Don't steal," right? And people call you and say, "I have stopped stealing," it doesn't validate your moral principle, right? It's not a philosophical argument for your moral principle, right? You can say, "Well, if it works, it works." Okay, but that's the same that the state does, right? It says, "I have a gut feeling that this is going to work." Hey, people pay taxes, so it works, right? Where is the philosophy? Where is the philosophy behind the ethics, behind NAP? Would somebody please tell me where the argument is? The principle in itself is not an argument. It's a result. Just like the car is not how you build a car, right? That's the result of building a car, right? Okay.
Convinced to not circumcise, to not hit their children, to not yell at their children. That's what I've been able to achieve. Now, let's say that they have 2 kids. So 1 million, 2 million kids, whatever it is. 1 million, 2 million kids are not being hit, screamed at, circumcised, and abused because of what I've been doing.
That's a bit of a stretch, I would think, right? But let's keep it fine. If you want to, your glory, what's it called?
That's just one of the many legacies that I have, but that's right. And again, I think it's in the millions.
Well, you don't have a legacy of explaining ethics very well, right? If you would say so yourself, you're probably saying you're the greatest ethics philosopher ever, but it's hard to understand what you are even saying, right? And if the NAP was developed many years ago, right? Somebody must have made some kind of philosophy or ethics to arrive at that principle. Otherwise, they just pulled it out of their ass, right? So if it was argued somehow, if it wasn't argued, let's say that's first, if it wasn't argued and you haven't been able to find any proof, any argument, or any philosophy, or any ethics, or anything that points out why NAP is valid, or let's say valid, right? Why are you using NAP? If you have seen a proof, why are you not presenting that proof instead of creating your own proof called UPB? That basically is a proof of NAP, right? Is it because there is no proof of NAP that you need to create your own ethics that could prove that NAP was right? So how does that work? I don't get it, right? If Murray Rothbard and Robert Nozick and Bastiat and whoever were Hans Hermann Hoppe and so on, whoever has been a forerunner of this principle. What's that guy called from Mises Institute? Never mind. Have they not presented any proof? Or why did you need to make your own proof of this NAP? I know that you're saying it's a proof or it's a system of proving any moral statement, but why does it need to be? Because there can only be one principle, right? There must be one principle that covers everything, in my opinion. Otherwise, there's some weakness in it that can be taken advantage of. And then we have a new state somewhere, right? Then violence will creep in somehow and manipulate people into whatever, right? It has to be a strong principle that everybody uses all the time, that is simple and understandable and works in an everyday scenario. And NAP doesn't do that, in my opinion.
Many millions, but let's just say it's 1 million, 2 million, So that's 1 million or 2 million kids not genitally mutilated, 1 million or 2 million kids not beaten on a regular basis, and not abused, and not confined, and not tortured, and so on, right? And peaceful parenting. I mean, that's just one of the things, but that's a pretty big thing. So
well, you don't know that, okay? It's great that you can argue parents into not beating their children, or at least reduce it very much, right? But you can't claim them, you know that. This is not knowledge because you don't have empirical data. You're not looking at all the families you have spoken to and influenced over the last 15 years in books and so on. And you say, okay, this book has been downloaded, therefore the parents must have read it and agree that they are not hitting their children, and therefore they haven't been hit in all their childhood. That's a bit of a stretch, right? I hope that they didn't do it. I would agree with that. It's a wishful thinking or a sincere hope that they didn't do it. But you don't know that. You're just creating figures that sound impressive in order to, create a very nice view of yourself as a very high moral standard kind of philosopher, right? It's great that you do that work. That's the only thing about what you're doing that I am greenlighting out of hand, right? If you can convince parents not to hit their children, I'm all for it. Keep going, right? Keep going. But when you start to do philosophy, well, it sucks like I don't know what, right? And that's what I'm attacking. I'm not attacking your ability to convince people not to hit their children. That's great. That's great. That's much better than spending time on conspiracies. I would certainly agree about that. But your work with parents has nothing to do with 9/11, right? As such, right? And the moral argument that you are trying to get into this debate, if you want to call it that, is what you're trying to constantly draw upon without explaining how you got to it, right? As I'm trying to enlighten here, you can't just say, I wrote a book 15 years ago and it seems to check out NAP, so it must be right. But why did you need to write that book if it was working 100 years before you wrote the book? right? Why didn't you just seek out the argument for that principle and check whether or not that holds water, right? So why was all this UPP necessary? If you're going to use the same principle that you used before you read the book, so what did you really change, right?
And
by the way, why were you so hung up on conspiracy theories back then when you wrote the book? Because you're saying now that it just takes folks away from the real thing.
Gone frame by frame over every piece of video you can grab a hold of these complicated events. And has that prevented one child from being beaten? Has that prevented one child from being mutilated? One child from being abused? Well, I know it hasn't. See, it's not about the world. It's about you. It's about you. And probably some personal issues that you have. And I say this with affection. You're listening to this show, so I say this with affection. I say this with some respect, and you care about the truth. You're a moral person. I get all of that. But you understand that you've just been kind of fooled, right? You've been kind of fooled. If you focusing on identifying the moral arguments that are valid in society against institutionalized coercion and convincing people to not abuse their children, that's something you have control over. If you put out a very strong anti-child abuse message, who knows how many people will pick up on it? But you don't want to do that, right? If you're into this other stuff, you don't want to do that. Why?
Why? So you didn't want to put that out before when you were into conspiracies in 2006 and the years before that. So you weren't dealing with child abuse. Well, as best as I know, you did do that. So it can't be compatible, right? You can't. One thing doesn't rule out the other. I know that it's always this sense of when I'm listening to you in the last 5-6 years, and I should have been more aware of it possibly in the 10 years before that, that there's always seems to be some underlying agenda that you are fitting your arguments and your philosophy around, right? And if that agenda changes for you somehow, then you're just fitting a new kind of philosophy around it, right? Back then you're talking about, you have all sorts of data evidence about what was possible or what was likely about 9/11. And now it seems it's not important at all, right? Have you listened through my deconstruction of your UPB and taken it any serious? Or are you just convinced that you are perfect and you don't need to listen to anybody? Or are you afraid that you might actually be convinced that there's something wrong and not sufficient about your UPB and then your NAP, right? Because that's the red thread through everything. That is the NAP. And if UPB doesn't work, you have to conclude that NAP doesn't work. And then all the NAP you might have spouted in the last 15 years might be bullshit, right? So you don't dare to do that. You're just pretending, even if you're not sure that UPB is right, that NAP must be right. Why are you bringing all this Christian morality into your foray in the last 4 or 5 years all of a sudden, right? Why do you need that if you have a secular ethics that you wrote a book about 15 years ago? Could it be because you no longer believe in your own ability to do ethics? That you understand that UPB is shit, right? And if UPB is shit, then you can't trust NAP without some alternative explanation of NAP. And that's why I'm challenging you to go find that freaking argument for NAP that was there before you wrote your book, right?
Clear moral benefit. Not one of the JFK people, not one of the 9/11 people have ever, through those arguments, convinced someone not to hit a child. How much initiation?
How the hell do you know that? Well, that's an incredible insight you have, right? Bullshit.
The use of force has been reduced by focusing on these two events. Just two events, could be any number, just these two events, right? How much net reduction in the amount of violence in society has been achieved by focusing on 9/11 and JFK? I mean, to ask the question is to answer it. How much net violence in society have I been able to reduce with me and a camera.
You haven't been able to reduce the state, have you? Right? Because NAP is all you were saying, you are talking about 9/11 from a state approach that focusing on 9/11 doesn't takes away focus from NAP, the general problem of violating NAP with the state. The state is violating that. So what have you done with the NAP to reduce the state? Right? You have done absolutely zero. On the contrary, you have supported Donald Trump, who has only made the debt larger, and everything is keep growing, right? Yeah, you're spouting some sort of weak argument that Donald Trump was sort of the elephant in the crystal store or the glass store, whatever it's called, right? The elephant in the room that sort of bounces around and exposes all the swamp and all that, right? But that's bullshit, right? Nothing has been reduced by NAP, right? Nothing. It doesn't reduce any states. I would even say that the state is actually following NAP in order to tax you, right? They're saying you are initiating violence against all those who are not going to get the money you're supposed to deliver because of the laws, right? So they can turn it around and point the guns on you and defend the other people against you not paying the money you should pay. How does NAP handle that, right? In fact, I would say the state is using NAP against us.
Me and a camera. So let's just say 1 million kids not getting mutilated. Well, I guess it'd be 500,000 because that'd be boys, right? So let's say 500,000 kids not being genitally mutilated, and that goes forward because then they will not do it to their son. So that just goes forward and wider. And let's say that the kids get hit once a week, right? So once a week, and they get hit once a week for 10 years, right? So that's 500 assaults, right? So 1 million kids, that's 500 million assaults against helpless and dependent children that I have prevented. 500 million assaults in the world, conservatively, have been prevented by my show, by what I've been doing. So you've been mucking about with asbestos and engineers and blueprints and specs and all of this, right?
I'm going to
what I respect that you want the truth.
Fast
but you got
forward
to get it and leave the esoteric impact on the world. And this is assuming that, I don't know, 1 to 2% of people end up not spanking. It's probably way higher than that. What about your children are really well behaved because of what I've done? Empiricist, I've said this from the very beginning, right? I'm an empiricist, which means that I care about actual things in the real world.
You're an empiricist. Okay. Would you mind give me a definition of what empiricism is? Would you agree with me that a way to see empiricism is that you need to have sense impressions in the moment to claim knowledge? So that it's only in the now, in the present, that you can have knowledge. You can have knowledge of the past, in the past or of the past. You can't have knowledge about the future, because that's, we have memory for the past and we have science for the future, or the best, most rigid way of predicting the future is science. But the future is not knowledge before it becomes the now, so to say, and the past is not knowledge, because neither of those, future or past, you have sense data, right? So we can only be in the now. Why don't you draw the conclusion that it's futile to spend too much energy on evidence to reach a conclusion if that conclusion inevitably must lead to some kind of knowledge? Because you can't reach knowledge about the past if you're an empiricist, right? So if you have another way of understanding empiricism, I would love to know. I might be wrong in my way of doing it. I would say you have to have sense data in the now in order to claim, or at least that which you claim to be knowledge must be at least based on sense data in the now. And what I mean by that is, if I experience elephant, I do not have sense of elephant. I have the 5 sense data, color and taste and sound and feel and so on, but I don't sense elephant. Elephant is a cognitive concept that is ignited by those specific scopes of sense data. When those sense data is combined in this way, in this placement and so on, it ignites an elephant in my mind. But the elephant is something I bring to it. It's not something that is empirical, right? But you could say that is knowledge then, right? And then the knowledge is based on empirical data in the now. I wouldn't have sense data about an elephant I experienced yesterday because it's on a memory. It's only a memory. The memory may hold the concept and the colors I experience. I have a memory of those because I can recall those colors and so on. But that doesn't mean I have empirical data of that elephant, right? Another way to see it is that if I went to New York in the year 2000, and I went to Manhattan and looked at these towers and said, wow, they're tall and they're interesting and they're great and they're whatever, right? And I went home and you lived on an island for 3 years and never saw television, never saw anything, basically never heard any inputs about knowledge from somewhere else. And somebody visited me on that island in 2003 and said, and we talked about New York, and I would say, well, there are these great towers in New York. They're impressive. And they're called the Twin Towers, and they're so impressive. And then the other person who had just arrived from New York would say, no, there are no Twin Towers. And then you would say, yes, I know there are Twin Towers. But the other person would say, I know there are no Twin Towers. So who was right? Right? You could say none of them are right. But at least the one who's, if we would change the scenario to that person would be standing in New York at that place where you claim you saw those towers, would say there are no towers in the telephone. And you're saying there is towers because I've seen them. Right? So this scenario challenges your idea of what empiricism means. You have to be having the impression of whatever it is you claim to know. And you can only have that in the now, right? You can only have it in the now. So
I don't care how right you are. I don't care how much research you've done. I don't care how many movies you've watched. I don't care how many books you've read. What I care about is give me the number. And this comes from both being an empiricist as a philosopher, but it also comes from being a business manager, right? You've got salespeople out there and they're like,
oh, you're talking about business. You lost about 900,000 customers on YouTube last year, didn't you? Right? Wasn't that, if you weren't a Bitcoin millionaire already, it would have been a business disaster to lose 900,000 subs or whatever it was on YouTube because you couldn't keep your account. Yeah, I know you're going to demonize, oh, YouTube, but a business manager would say it's a failure that I have lost that account, right? But we're not going to talk about that. No, but then we go over to the good people and the evil people and the evil people and the state and the New World Order. They have infiltrated YouTube and they're going to, oh, so there's a conspiracy. Okay, yeah, sure.
Like, well, I did this and I did that and I did the other thing and this, and it's like, okay, that's great. I don't care. You tell me, how many sales did you close this week? How much money changed hands? How many contracts were signed? How many sales did you actually make? Well, but I went through this initiative and then I went to this conference and then I did this trade show and then I put out these mail outs. It's like, yeah, I don't care. I don't care. I don't care. What I care about is how many sales did you close? I can't pay my payroll with your going to a conference. I can't pay my payroll with you sending out mailers. In fact, that costs me. The only way I can pay my employees.
So why were you spending so much time on conspiracies back in 2006? Huh? Would that have influenced your ability to write a book about ethics? Huh? You were spending so much time on understanding these conspiracy scenarios, right? I mean, it's, and when did you can, as a good the good sophist you are, you can always find some ex post facto justification for your changes in your philosophy, and if all else fails, you can always say, well, I grew up. You have to get on and get further, and you know, when you're arguing for the wall against the Mexicans, right? Which is a isn't it an assault? Isn't it an aggression on people who want to move from A to B if they traverse a route that goes through that area where that wall would be, and building, if Donald Trump builds a wall, does he spend his own money or does he spend taxpayers' money, and isn't it a violation, and so on? Why are you focusing on the wall instead of the non-aggression principle, right? Why?
Is if you actually close the deals, close the sales. It's empiricism.
Okay, I think he was talking a bit about the official story, as if he has accepted the official story, but I think I will let it rest here. I'm getting a little tired of almost 2 hours of ranting against this so-called philosopher. I urge you to watch the rest of the video and see if there's something you can use that could be interesting in this context. Otherwise, I hope it was enlightening to you, and hopefully Stefan Molyneux watches this also and not only says, what an idiot that Mandibil. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He's not a real philosopher. He only has 150 subs on whatever. Well, that's 150 subs more than you have on YouTube, right? And because he doesn't have the arguments, he has only got his sophistry. He can't argue philosophically. If you go through the last 4 or 5 years of his shows, there's basically no philosophy. There's no philosophy. It's just a word he slaps on to sound like he knows what he's talking about. He might know something, a thing or two about what he's talking about, but it's not very philosophically rigid what he's doing, right? And that's what pisses me off, right? He keeps going with this UPB as if everything is solved, and nobody, he can't. I mean, how many people have you sold UPB to besides your acolytes who are only in there because they're sadists and flying monkey behind the curtains of Freedomain, right? How many people out in the real world have you sold UPB to, right? And if you have sold UPB to them, what moral principles have they run through UPB? That could be an interesting thing to know about, right? Maybe it's the best fucking moral principle in the world that people have found using UPB. Anybody, anyone, have you any feedback on that, right? If you're such a big, businessman, what feedback have you got on UPB except people telling you it doesn't work? It sucks like a vacuum, right? See you next time.